The snow was falling harder than anyone in town had expected. It wasn't just a gentle winter flurry. It was a full-on blizzard, the kind that makes even the bravest drivers pull over and rethink their choices. Roads were closing one after another, and the small town at the edge of the mountains had gone quiet. But down a narrow, frozen stretch of highway, 15 bikers found themselves trapped in the storm. Their leather jackets and heavy boots weren't made for weather like this, and their roaring engines were no match for the sheets of white that buried the roads. They were members of a group most people kept their distance from, the kind of men who usually made heads turn and whispers spread when they rolled into town. But that night they weren't the intimidating figures people imagined. They were cold, stranded, and in desperate need of shelter. At the very same time, just a few miles away, an elderly woman sat by her fire, knitting as the wind howled outside her window. She lived alone in a small wooden house that had stood for generations, a place filled with warmth, quiet memories, and the kind of kindness that never fades with age. Her neighbors all knew her as someone who would give whatever she had to help, but even she could not have guessed what, or who, was about to knock on her door that night. When the sound finally came, it wasn't a polite knock but a heavy pounding, urgent and desperate. She opened the door to find 15 massive men, covered in snow, their breath fogging in the icy air. They looked rough, weathered, and more than a little intimidating to anyone who didn't know better. Most people would have slammed the door shut out of fear, but she didn't. She didn't ask questions, didn't hesitate. She simply stepped aside and let them in, offering warmth and shelter to complete strangers who clearly needed it. Inside her little home, the sight was almost surreal. The roaring bikers sat quietly on her old couches and wooden chairs, steam rising from their jackets as they thawed out by the fire. She brewed tea, ladled soup, and laid out blankets as if she had been expecting them all along. The men, who were used to people staring at them with suspicion, now sat in silence, humbled by the simple kindness of a woman who had no reason to trust them. Outside, the snowstorm raged through the night, and the small wooden house became a haven no one could have imagined. What started as a desperate search for shelter was turning into something far greater, a bond being formed in the unlikeliest of places. But what happened when the storm cleared was something that left the entire neighborhood speechless. Because the next morning, when the sun finally broke through and the snow began to melt, the sound of engines echoed down the street. Not just a handful, but rows and rows of motorcycles, dozens of them, lined up at the old lady's door. And that was only the beginning of what her small act of kindness would lead to. The old lady rubbed her eyes that morning, wondering if she was still dreaming. The snow was piled high along the street, but what truly caught her attention was the sound, the deep, rumbling growl of motorcycle engines filling the air. She stepped outside, her breath visible in the cold morning light, and froze. All the way down her street, lined up like soldiers in formation, were motorcycles. Not just the 15 from last night, but at least 100 more. The road looked like a sea of chrome and steel, stretching farther than her eyes could follow. Neighbors peeked nervously from their curtains, whispering among themselves, unsure what was happening. For most people in town, the sight of so many bikers gathering would stir fear and suspicion. But for the old woman who had spent her night pouring tea and making soup for weary strangers, it sparked a different feeling, something between curiosity and wonder. The night before had felt almost like a dream itself. When the bikers entered her home, their faces were hard, but their eyes told another story. They were exhausted, chilled to the bone, and a little uncertain of how she would react. But the warmth of her welcome softened them. She had always believed that kindness had a way of disarming people, and last night she saw it happen right before her eyes. The men who were known for roaring down highways and commanding attention now sat quietly at her table, eating homemade soup like children who hadn't had a proper meal in weeks. Some even helped her clear dishes when they finished, awkwardly trying to fit their large hands around her delicate plates. Yet as she looked out at the 100 bikes that morning, she realized that something more was going on. It wasn't just about shelter from a storm anymore. News must have spread quickly among the group, and now riders from beyond the town had come. But why so many? Why were they here, outside her little house, their engines idling as if they were waiting for something? She could feel the tension building in the air. The neighbors saw danger, but the old woman sensed something else, something that hadn't yet revealed itself. The bikers from the night before began stepping outside, now refreshed after a night's rest. They stood beside their bikes, nodding to the new arrivals with a silent kind of respect. One of them, a tall man with weathered skin and tired eyes, turned to the old lady with a look that made her heart pound. He seemed to want to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he placed a hand over his chest, a gesture of quiet gratitude, before walking to join the others. The street was completely transformed. What was once a quiet little neighborhood now looked like the center of something much bigger than anyone understood. People whispered about trouble, about gangs, about what might happen next. But the old lady, standing there in her simple sweater and snow boots, felt none of that fear. She didn't know their story, not yet, but she could tell by the way they had treated her in her home that there was more to these men than anyone had ever cared to see. And as the engines roared louder, echoing against the snow-covered houses, she realized this was only the beginning. Something was about to unfold in her life that no one in town could have imagined. The question was, why had they all come here, and what did they want from her now? The street was buzzing with the sound of engines, but beneath it all there was an unsettling quiet, the kind that comes before something important is revealed. The old lady stood on her porch clutching her shawl tighter, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of it. One by one, more bikers began to arrive. Their breath steamed in the cold air, their boots crunching on the frozen ground. Some leaned against their bikes, others stood with arms crossed, their eyes fixed on the little house that had sheltered their brothers through the storm. It felt like the entire world had narrowed down to this one street, this one moment, and no one could guess what would happen next. Inside her house, the fire had gone out, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and the traces of warmth that had carried them all through the night. The mugs she had handed out were still stacked in the sink, a reminder of the unexpected gathering that had taken place just hours earlier. For her, it had been a simple act of kindness, opening her door, offering food and warmth. But for the bikers, it clearly meant something more. She didn't yet understand it, but she could feel it. And when you live alone as long as she had, you learn to trust feelings. From the corner house across the street, a man pulled out his phone and whispered into it, his eyes darting nervously between the bikes. Word was spreading fast. Some neighbors feared trouble, others wanted to call the police. The town had always been quiet, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved to each other on the way to church. Now it felt like that peace was hanging by a thread. The tension between fear and curiosity was thick enough to touch, and everyone waited to see how it would break. Among the bikers there were different voices too. Some spoke quietly in groups, gesturing toward the old woman's house as if debating what to do next. Others lit cigarettes, their smoke curling up into the pale morning sky. The men from last night seemed different from the rest, protective almost, like they carried a secret the others hadn't yet been told. The tall man who had placed his hand over his chest kept glancing back at her porch, as though trying to reassure her without saying a word. It was clear he wanted her to trust them, but the sheer number of riders now filling the street made that harder with every passing minute. The old lady's mind wandered to the photographs on her mantel. Her late husband, a war veteran who had taught her that true courage wasn't about fighting, but about standing firm in the face of uncertainty. She whispered a quiet prayer, asking for strength, then looked back at the road that had transformed into something like a gathering ground. No one had explained why they were all there. Was it gratitude, protection, or something else entirely? The answer lay hidden in the way they stood, waiting, as if someone or something hadn't yet arrived. The mystery deepened with every rev of an engine, and though the morning sun glinted off the snow, the old woman felt the chill of a truth that was still on its way. She had no idea that the real storm was just beginning. The engines finally went silent, and for a moment the street was so still it felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. 100 bikes stood in perfect rows, their chrome glinting in the weak winter sun, the men beside them like shadows waiting for something unseen. The old lady remained on her porch, her fingers gripping the wooden railing, every instinct telling her that this gathering was about more than last night's storm. She could feel the weight of it in the air, a kind of electricity that made her chest tighten and her thoughts race. Then it happened. A single rider broke from the line. His bike rolled slowly toward her house, the growl of the engine echoing off the frozen houses. He was different from the others, older, his presence commanding without him saying a word. The men around him seemed to straighten, their eyes following his every move. The old lady could tell immediately that this was someone important, someone the rest respected enough to fall silent for. He stopped his bike at the edge of her walkway, killed the engine, and removed his helmet. His face was lined, his eyes sharp, but there was something unreadable in them, something that made her heart skip. The neighbors were now gathering behind their curtains in nervous clusters. Whispers traveled from window to window. Who was this man, and why had he come here with so many behind him? Some swore they recognized him, though none could agree on from where. A few people stepped out onto their porches, only to retreat again under the heavy stares of the riders. The entire town seemed caught in a strange and fragile balance, teetering on the edge of fear and awe. The old lady's front door creaked behind her as one of the men from last night stepped out. It was the tall one, the one who had offered her that silent gesture of gratitude. He walked past her, shoulders broad, his boots crunching in the snow, until he stood between her porch and the man on the bike. There was no shouting, no hostility, just a tense exchange of glances that spoke louder than words. Something unspoken passed between them, and whatever it was, it carried weight. The old lady tried to piece it together. Why her? Why her little wooden house on a quiet street that no one usually paid attention to? She had always lived simply, her days filled with knitting, baking, and tending to her garden in the warmer months. Yet here she was, standing at the center of something that felt larger than life, as if her small act of kindness had unlocked a story far bigger than she could have imagined. The older rider finally swung his leg over his bike and began walking slowly toward her porch. Each step seemed deliberate, heavy, the kind that made every man around him straighten as if awaiting a decision. The old lady's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the eyes of her entire neighborhood on her, waiting, just as much as the riders were. The silence deepened. The man was now only a few feet away, his boots leaving deep prints in the snow. The tall biker at her side shifted slightly, as though bracing for whatever might come next. The air itself seemed to hum with suspense. And just as the man opened his mouth to speak, the sound of more engines cut through the air, this time coming from the far end of town. Another wave of riders was approaching. The old lady's grip on the railing tightened. Whatever was about to unfold had only just reached its most dangerous point. The old lady's eyes darted toward the sound, her heart pounding as the distant rumble grew louder. At first it was faint, like thunder rolling over the mountains, but within moments the street was vibrating beneath her feet. Another wave of motorcycles poured into the neighborhood, their headlights cutting through the morning light, tires hissing as they rolled across the slush and snow. The townspeople who had been brave enough to peek from their windows quickly ducked back, the fear now unmistakable. This wasn't just a gathering, it was something much bigger, and it was happening right in front of her home. The older rider paused in his tracks, his sharp eyes narrowing as the new group drew closer. The tall biker at the porch tensed instantly, his jaw tightening as if he already knew what this meant. The original 100 men stood straighter beside their bikes, their posture shifting from stillness to readiness. The air changed, the once united sound of engines now dividing the street into two sides. The old woman, who had only wanted to give shelter from a storm, suddenly found herself standing between forces she didn't understand. When the new wave of riders came to a halt, the silence that followed was even heavier than before. Their leader stepped forward, pulling off his helmet, revealing a face that was younger but every bit as hardened as the older man's. His eyes scanned the house, the street, and finally the porch, where the old lady stood trembling but refusing to step back. Something flickered in his gaze when it landed on her. Recognition, perhaps, or something deeper she couldn't yet place. The tall biker glanced at her, his expression protective, almost pleading, as if asking her to stay calm. That simple look told her more than words ever could. There was history here, something buried, and she had somehow stumbled into the center of it. The neighbors, caught between curiosity and fear, began to speculate in hushed voices. Some believed the riders were there to fight over territory. Others thought the old woman herself must be tied to something from their past. But the truth was murkier than either guess. From the way the men eyed each other, it was clear this wasn't just about turf or pride. It was personal. The older leader took a step closer, his voice finally breaking the silence. He didn't raise it, but the authority in his tone made everyone listen. She opened her door when no one else would. That means something. Don't forget it. His words hung heavy in the freezing air. The younger leader smirked faintly, shaking his head. Or maybe it means she doesn't know who she's dealing with. His men shifted restlessly behind him, their boots crunching in the snow. The tension between the two groups was palpable, and the old woman could feel it pressing down on her like the weight of the storm itself. Her simple act of kindness had spiraled into something she couldn't have predicted. Two groups, two leaders, and one little house caught in the middle. The stakes had risen far beyond her understanding, but one thing was certain: the next moments would decide everything. And as the sound of yet another engine roared faintly in the distance, the old woman realized the conflict was still far from reaching its peak. Someone else was coming, and with them answers, or more questions she wasn't ready to face. The third engine grew louder until a single motorcycle appeared at the end of the street, its headlight cutting through the cold morning air. Unlike the others, it didn't ride in with an army behind it. Came alone. The sound of that one bike made both sides go quiet, as if every man there knew exactly who it was. The old lady clutched the railing tighter, sensing that whatever this was, it would decide everything. The rider stopped between the two groups, killed the engine, and removed his helmet. His hair was streaked with gray, his face weathered, but his eyes held a calm authority that immediately pulled the tension in a new direction. Both the older leader and the younger one stiffened, exchanging a glance that told the old woman more than words ever could. This man wasn't just another rider. He was the one they both answered to, the one they hadn't expected to show up. He looked at the house, then at the woman standing on the porch, and for a moment the entire street seemed to hold still. He walked slowly toward her, every boot step echoing in the cold air, until he stood at the foot of her porch steps. His voice was steady, low, but it carried to every corner of the crowd. "You gave my men shelter when they had nowhere else to go. That's not something we forget." The younger leader shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to argue, but the man silenced him with a single look. The older leader bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect, and suddenly the conflict that had been building all morning seemed to collapse in on itself. The men, who moments earlier had looked ready for a fight, now stood quiet, their energy changing from hostility to something almost reverent. The old lady, still trembling, finally found her voice. "I didn't do anything special," she said softly. "You were cold. You were hungry. That's all." The man's gaze softened, and he gave a small nod. Sometimes the smallest things are the hardest to find. He turned to his men, his voice rising. "This house is off limits. This woman is under our protection. Anyone who forgets that answers to me." The roar of approval that followed shook the neighborhood, but instead of fear, the sound carried a strange kind of relief. The neighbors peeking from their windows began to understand. The bikers hadn't gathered for war. They had gathered to show respect, to stand guard for the woman who had shown them kindness when no one else dared. The men began mounting their bikes, row after row preparing to leave, their engines filling the air again with thunder. The street that had been choked with tension now pulsed with something different: unity, gratitude, and an unspoken promise. Just as the old woman thought it was over, the man at the steps turned back to her. His eyes searched hers for a long moment before he said quietly, "You may not remember me, but years ago your husband saved my life. Last night when you opened your door, it was as if he was still watching over us." The old lady's breath caught in her chest. Memories of her husband flooded back, and she realized this wasn't just about a snowstorm or bikers stranded on a road. It was about a connection stretching across time, a circle of kindness finding its way back home. And as the sound of 100 engines rolled away into the distance, leaving her little house standing quiet once more, she knew the world outside would never look at her, or her kindness, the same way again. The street was silent again, though it felt different now. Where fear had weighed heavy just hours earlier, there was now a kind of reverence in the air. The old woman stood on her porch, her hands resting on the railing, still shaken by what she had just learned. Her husband had been gone for years, but his memory lived on in ways she never expected. The revelation that one of the bikers, the man who commanded such respect, had once owed his life to her late husband was something she couldn't quite put into words. It felt like a message from the past, a reminder that kindness doesn't end when someone leaves this world. Keeps moving forward, touching people in ways you might never see. Her neighbors slowly began stepping out of their homes, their nervous faces giving way to questions and disbelief. Some approached her porch carefully, as if afraid the bikers might suddenly return. Others whispered among themselves about what they had just witnessed. For years, the town had thought of motorcycle clubs only in terms of fear and reputation. But after seeing how those men treated her, after watching them line up 100 bikes outside her little house in honor of a simple act of shelter, they began to realize there was more to the story than anyone had imagined. Inside, the old woman tidied the dishes left from the night before. She smiled faintly as she rinsed the mugs, remembering the way those rough-looking men had sat quietly, sipping tea, saying thank you with their eyes even when they couldn't find the words. She thought about the tall rider who had tried to shield her that morning, the older leader who had bowed his head in respect, and the lone man who had carried the truth of her husband's past. Each of them had left an imprint on her heart, and she knew she had left one on theirs too. Over the next few days, something remarkable began to happen. The riders didn't linger in town, but word of what they did spread quickly. People from neighboring towns called it unbelievable, that a group known for toughness and grit would stand in silence to honor an elderly woman. For the old lady, it wasn't about the attention. It was about the lesson she had always lived by. That compassion costs nothing, but it can change everything. As the snow melted and the roads cleared, she sat by her fire one evening, her knitting in her lap, reflecting on how a simple choice to open her door had brought an entire street, and maybe an entire town, to see the world differently. She realized that people often judge by appearances, assuming they know who someone is just by how they look. But real character is revealed in moments of struggle, in how we treat one another when no one else is watching. In the weeks that followed, she sometimes heard the faint roar of motorcycles passing through town. They never stopped, never crowded her street again, but she knew they hadn't forgotten. The sound became a reminder, a promise, that her kindness had not only been received but carried forward. And though her little wooden house went back to its quiet life, she felt something within her had shifted. Her husband's legacy had returned to her in the most unexpected way, and she now understood that kindness always finds its way back, often multiplied. So whenever people asked her about that snowy night, she would simply smile and say, "I just opened my door." Because sometimes the smallest actions can create the biggest stories, and sometimes one act of kindness can echo louder than the sound of 100 engines.